The Jets have been one of the league's most active teams in free agency this year, but they may not be done yet. Plus, Robert Saleh speaks at the NFL owners' meetings. We'll break it all down today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Monday, March 25th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, the Jets have been very active in free agency so far, but they may not be done yet. Late last week, they brought in a big name player for a visit. Today's show, we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about some comments Robert Saleh made early Monday morning at the NFL owners' meetings in Orlando, Florida. Now, of course, if you've been following the Jets this offseason, you've seen a lot of big names get at it. Tyron Smith, one of the best left tackles of his generation, was signed a week ago. Late last week, the Jets agreed to terms with wide receiver Mike Williams on a one-year contract. Williams coming off a ACL injury, looking to rebuild his value on a one-year deal with Aaron Rodgers throwing to him. A player the Jets who brings a skill set the Jets lacked at the wide receiver position. A player who is an excellent wide receiver, much better than anybody the Jets had other than Garrett Wilson. And then to a lesser extent, but still a significant move, the Jets traded for Morgan Moses early on during the free agency period. So Jets have made 3 big additions. Well, now there's talk that maybe there's a 4th coming down the line, and that's Jadeveon Clowney, the veteran defensive end, the veteran edge rusher who has played with many teams through his career, spent 2023 with the Baltimore Ravens, had a career-high 9.5 sacks. Guy who was the number 1 overall pick a decade ago of the Houston Texans and never quite fulfilled the promise of that pick. When he was drafted, people thought he was going to be like a TJ Watt kind of guy, or a guy, or kind of like a player who was picked a few slots after him, Khalil Mack. He never was quite that good, but he's been a good to very good player during the course of his career. He's actually, occasionally made a second team All-Pro, guy who's an excellent run defender. And, most edge rushers who make a name for themselves, they do it because of their pass rushing. But Clowney does a great job setting the edge. But he's also a pretty decent pass rusher. If you look at it historically, he's never had a 10-sack season, but he's had some 9-sack seasons through his career. And he's also always had a pretty decent pressure rate. So Jets bring him in for a visit, and the fan base is all fired up about it. And, I know sometimes you want me to be really passionate for or really passionate against a move. But in this case, I really can't be, because I think it would be a move that, depending on the price, it'd probably be fine. But I don't think it would have an outsized impact on the New York Jets. In fact, I think it would get a lot of hype, but I don't know that it necessarily would have the impact that a lot of people are making it out to have. It's kind of weird because I think through much of his career, Clowney's been kind of underrated because he came into the NFL with such promise, with so many expectations. He never really met them, but he was always a decent player. And now I feel like maybe he's gotten a little overrated based on the levels of attention him visiting the Jets last week generated. Now, we never know. I thought Mike Williams was going to leave the team facility without signing a contract. I thought he was going to go to his other visits, and he ended up signing before he left the building. Jets did not let him leave the building, for those of you who like that phrase. I think Clowney, through his career, though, has shown that he's willing to, he likes to go at his own pace. Sometimes Clowney's been remained a free agent late into the process. He kind of picks his team. Now, would he help the Jets defensive end spot? Yeah, I think he would. He's a good run defender. He's a decent pass rusher. Again, has a couple 9-sack seasons, has a pretty good pressure rate. Would he be the kind of guy that changes everything? Well, I don't think so, for a couple of reasons. First of all, he's not that sort of transcendent pass rusher. He's not the kind of guy that really gets after the quarterback consistently. So that's number one. Number two is I don't know that he's going to get a ton of snaps with the Jets, unless there's a second move, and that would be the question mark. What's the move that comes after signing Clowney? But unless he gets like a second move, you'd probably assume he's going to get, I don't know, like 400 to 500 snaps. That's not really enough to make a big impact. And if you look at like Clowney's career, what I'd expect is really good run defense. I'd expect him to generate a decent number of pressures, and I'd expect probably like 5 to 6 sacks, and that's fine. And that's not a bad thing. And it'd help the Jets, but it's not the type of thing that changes the trajectory of this team the way maybe like a Tyron Smith or a Mike Williams do. And part of the reason for that is the Jets' defensive line is already pretty good. You got Quinn Williams up front. You got a couple talented defensive ends and Jermaine Johnson, who's coming off a Pro Bowl season. You still have John Franklin Myers around. You have the first round pick last year, Will McDonald. Part of it's just not that glaring of a need. It's not a spot where the Jets necessarily need a ton of help. And part of me wonders, if you sign Clowney, is he taking snaps away from McDonald? And that leads you down a whole another discussion is, should the Jets be giving these snaps to their first round pick a year ago? Or if they sign Clowney, is it a sign that maybe they don't really like his trajectory? Maybe it's kind of a hedge against that. And if that's the case, then you wonder why they didn't bring Huff back. But these are all discussions far down the road. I do wonder a bit if they sign Clowney, does it mean, and this is just pure speculation, I'm not giving you any insider information here, but just kind of taking like an educated guess, it does make me wonder, would they maybe look to trade John Franklin Myers, who, is a guy who kind of fits the role Clowney would play with the Jets, where he's kind of like the power end. Job's to hold up against the run, kind of keep the linebackers clean. Your Jets have some smaller, faster linebackers, which means you want some big guys up front who can tie up blocks in the run game and also collapse the pocket. And the Jets are short on draft picks this year. They're down a second round pick. JFM, nearing his late 20s. Clowney's older than him, but JFM, kind of had a down year last year. And I wonder maybe are the Jets viewing it as a situation where maybe you try and sell off JFM a year before his value really plummets. I don't know. This JFM could very well have a bounce back season, but just trying to lay out like what the scenarios are here, because I think if the Jets sign Clowney, I don't think I think it'd be tough for me to object unless the money was crazy, but I think it would almost bring more questions than it would answers. And I don't really know exactly where he fits. Now, I'm of the mindset that you can never have too many quality defensive ends. So that's why I'm not like shouting on the rooftop, don't do it. Because I think Clowney's a good player. In fact, there were many years where the Jets had nothing at the defensive end position where I said, these guys available. Why aren't you trying to sign him? So the Jets finally listening to me a bit. But I just don't think this would have as big of an impact. And again, a lot of it's just because he's probably taking snaps away from guys who are already good, and you're adding to the depth, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's not like you're going from a situation where Carter Warren is starting at left tackle currently, and you bring in Tyron Smith. That's a big change. It's not a situation where you have, I don't know, maybe Jason Brownlee or Alan Lazard starting on the outside, and you bring in Mike Williams. That's a huge upgrade. That's a game-changing type of move. We're talking about the Jets defensive line. It's not, it's a good unit. It's a unit where they felt comfortable enough letting a really talented young edge rusher, Bryce Huff, go. So, if you're doing that, is Clowney really essential? Again, I think he could help. I don't think it would necessarily be a bad move, but I think that this is a situation where maybe the name's a little bit bigger than the actual impact would be for the Jets. So I'm sorry. I know you probably really wanted me to be passionately for or against the idea of signing Jadeveon Clowney, but I'm not. I think it's fine if they do. I think it's fine if they don't. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to the head coach. Robert Saleh spoke Monday morning at the NFL owners meetings. He had a few things that were interesting to say, and we'll talk about what they were as we continue this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. You can admit it. Your bracket's probably busted right now. You probably made some picks that did not pan out, and it's not your fault. I mean, the tournament does not really follow a lot of logic. And you may be frustrated because now you're out of your pool. Well, again, that's where FanDuel comes in, because you can bet on every game of the NCAA tournament. And again, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Are you a big fan of the show? And are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today on Locked On Jets, we're turning our attention to the NFL owners' meetings, which are taking place in Orlando, Florida. Jets head coach Robert Saleh spoke to the media. Typically, you get some of the big decision makers to have a media availability during these NFL offseason events. And as usual, you got a lot of coach speak, but there were a few things worth noting that Saleh had to say. I think number one, it was Elijah Vera Tucker. Saleh confirmed that he's playing right guard. And that's not a big surprise. I mean, I guess you could kind of figure that out based on the moves the Jets made this offseason, because heading into the offseason, theoretically, it was possible AVT could end up at one of four spots, because through his career, in just 3 years, he's played both tackle spots and both guard spots. Well, the Jets the last 2 years have made it a point to play him at right guard to start the season. That's been their objective, and they've had to kind of shuffle him around because of injuries. But if you look at this offseason, we enter with AVT having the potential to play four spots. Okay, well, the Jets traded for Morgan Moses. He's a right tackle, so he's probably not AVT's probably not going there. The Jets signed John Simpson from Baltimore. He's played left guard his whole career. So if AVT's playing guard, then it's probably not going to be on the left side. The Jets then signed Tyron Smith, who's a left tackle. Yeah, I think Tyron Smith's playing left tackle if you look at his history. So that leaves the right guard spot for AVT. I think that's the best thing for AVT. I'll be honest with you. I was kind of nervous heading into this offseason. I was kind of fretting because I felt like the Jets were leaning towards playing him at tackle. And if you looked at the tackle market, it was not good. And I think you have to give the Jets credit for what they've done, because there were not a lot of options available that made sense. And the Jets were able to get two of them. The guard market looked much more robust. And I understand, you look at the top of the market, there were a lot of huge money deals that went out, but there are still some quality players in the interior line who signed for more reasonable contracts. I felt like that was the direction the Jets were going to head. And I do not think that was really the best thing for AVT. I think, if you look at him, the Jets placed him at guard for a reason. And I know I'm giving the Jets credit here, which it's always dangerous to do. It's always dangerous to use the Jets logic as evidence of anything. But I think that AVT is better at guard. I think, especially coming off an injury, he's kind of an athleticism-based player. Anyway, there's a different type of athleticism you need to win at guard than there is at tackle. Coming off an Achilles injury, I don't think placing him at a tackle was a great idea. And I think, generally speaking, when we talk about how well he played at tackle the last couple of years, that's kind of grading on the curve that it was an emergency move. It's kind of saying, for a guy who had to be thrown out there on short notice, where it wasn't part of the plan, he held up okay. There were some shaky moments AVT did have at tackle the last couple of years. So I think he's better off inside, and Saleh confirms that. Again, no real surprise, but I think that, welcome news for the New York Jets. And then Saleh also talked about some of the positions they're interested in adding. Saleh mentioned the running back position. And again, that's no surprise. And I know there are some Izzy Abanikanda fans out there. And the way I look at it is, there's nothing to stop Izzy from getting playing time, especially at a position like running back. If you show you can produce, the coaches are going to put you on the field. That's different from depending on Izzy Abanikanda to be your number 2 running back, though. And I don't know that we saw a whole lot from him, and admittedly limited action, admittedly in a very tough spot. But I mean, based on what we saw last year, would you be confident with him being like the number 2 guy behind Breece Hall, a guy who's in today's NFL, a number 2 back, going to see a fair amount of playing time, going to see a fair share of carries? And, the running back position is one where you got to be careful, because you can always Dalvin Cook things up and, sign a guy for too much money who doesn't have much left in the tank. And heck knows, we've been through that with the Jets in recent years. But, if you can find like a good low usage guy who maybe his team did not appreciate him in the free agency market, that's not necessarily such a bad move. So Jets still interested in adding to the running back room. Saleh also mentioned the Jets are not done at the safety position. Now, I think a lot of fans are focused on some of the higher end guys like Simmons from Denver, but I don't think the Jets necessarily need to go in that direction. I like what the Jets have at safety. I think Now, look, may not love the Jets safety position if like the rest of the defense wasn't so good, but we're talking about the safeties on the Jets defense, where you have a talented defensive line, where you have good linebackers, where you have great corners. You're above average in the three other spots. And safety, generally speaking, anyway, is probably like the lowest impact position on the defense. So you can certainly get by with Tony Adams and Chuck Clark. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad place to add, because the position is just viewed as such a low value spot in today's NFL. And we've talked about this on the show over the last couple of weeks, how it just feels like the safety market's going to be soft this offseason. And it's not necessarily going to be a guy that you feel like you need to go get. There's going to be somebody who's available, like as we get into like April, May, June, who's going to be there, and it's not going to cost that much. And it just gives you good depth. And so I think that I think that's the right spot for the Jets to look, because after Adams and Clark, you don't really have a whole lot. And the guy who it could be is Ashton Davis, who reportedly was not re-signing with the Jets because he was seeking a starting job. And look, I like what Ashton Davis did last year, but he did that in a part-time role. And I don't know that Ashton Davis, especially in this market where there are going to be a lot of good guys available, is going to have many offers to be a starting safety. He may have to settle for a backup role. And if he does, well, the Jets would be a good spot for that, wouldn't they? But if not, I'm not panicked about the safety position, just because I think there's still a lot of good players available, and not everybody's going to get a starting role. Safety is a spot in the NFL where you can kind of go the less expensive route and still get quality play. And again, for the Jets, when you're talking about your safeties, you're talking about like maybe like your 9th and 10th or 10th and 11th best players on defense. There's a lot of quality on this defense anyway. So it's in general, it's not really a high impact position, but especially for a team like the Jets, where you're good at linebacker, you're good at defensive line, and you're great at corner, you don't necessarily need a great safety. Look, I'll take an upgrade anywhere I can get it. But if we're just talking about resource allocation, if we're talking about like where the Jets are spending big, where the Jets are really utilizing the resources, I think safety would be pretty low on that list. And Salah also mentioned the Jets were going to get a third quarterback, and the smart money seems to be they're going to draft somebody in the mid to late rounds this year, kind of be a developmental guy. Zach Wilson likely on his way out of town. It's one of those things that, like, I don't understand why teams lack a third quarterback on their roster, because in today's NFL, they just changed the rule last year that you can have a quarterback active who does not count against your allotment of active players. It's essentially like a bonus active player if you have a third quarterback. So if you don't have a third quarterback on your roster, you're essentially wasting a free active player. You're essentially wasting a free bonus spot that the league gives you. And in case of an emergency, and I understand that like there are very few games where your top two quarterbacks get hurt, but in case your top two quarterbacks go down, you now have somebody who can at least function in the shell of your offense. So, the Jets probably looking at drafting somebody, but Salah confirms that there will be a third quarterback on this team in 2024. But that's not all Salah confirmed. As we continue on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets, we're going to turn our attention to injuries. Salah gave us some injury updates, and they're all pretty good. I'll tell you what they are as we continue this Monday edition. It's Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. Robert Saleh spoke Monday morning at the NFL owners meetings in Orlando, Florida. You hear from a lot of the decision makers at these meetings. They have a media availability, and they tend to not give you a whole lot of information because we're still in the offseason. The draft is coming up. Nobody really wants to give away their plan, but Robert Saleh did provide some injury updates on some players returning from injuries from the Jets. He confirmed Aaron Rodgers should be back by spring practices. I don't know how important these spring practices are for Rodgers. I mean, a couple of years ago, he skipped the offseason program in Green Bay and won the MVP. I always view this, and I've heard from enough players to feel that this is a pretty solid take. The offseason program can be important for like a young guy who's trying to develop. Somebody who is not proven in the league. It's an extra chance to practice. It's an extra chance to impress your coaches. For somebody like Rodgers knows how to prepare. The veteran guys like a Quinnen Williams or a Sauce Gardner, these guys know how to prepare for the season. These guys, you can count on these guys being in great shape, ready to go for training camp. So for somebody like Aaron Rodgers, do I care if he's at the offseason program? And I understand, some people will say he's the leader of the team, he's the quarterback, he needs to be there. Well, then explain why he missed the offseason program a couple of years ago in Green Bay and won the MVP. It's one of those things. Like last year when he was new to the team, I guess it was nice to have him there. Nice to show, it was nice to show right after the trade that he was committed. But I don't think it's as big of a deal. I think the more significant thing is that Salah kind of indicated Rodgers' recovery is on track. And, by all accounts, he suffered the injury in September. that's plenty of time for him to be ready for the start of this coming season. I don't think there was ever any question about that. I mean, aside from all the drama last year about whether he was going to return during the 2023 season, which was never very realistic, I think the expectation's always been that Rodgers is going to be back for week 1 this season, and Saleh confirms that. Saleh also indicated that Elijah Vera Tucker, they're expecting him back for week 1, which that's actually a new development because the Jets had been a little evasive about what AVT's status was. They had kind of hedged their bets about when he was going to be available. There was some talk a few weeks ago. Is he going to be ready for the offseason program? Is he going to be ready for training camp? Well, this stuff, we'll see what happens with AVT. You never really know what the trajectory of an injury time frame is going to be, but the Jets suggested that they're expecting AVT to be back for week 1. And that's something that's very welcome news because at the moment we're recording this podcast, Jets do not have a great offensive line depth. If we talk about like where the Jets offensive line rates, if everybody's healthy and everybody's playing at their best, this is an above average offensive line, but they don't really have a lot. And look, there are a lot of teams that don't have offensive line depth. The NFL is going through an offensive line shortage. And that's why you see some of the contracts in free agency for offensive linemen that are being given out. It's also because anybody who's good typically has a starting job, and you have to develop your backups. If we're talking about just in today's NFL, how you get quality backup linemen, you have to hit on those like mid to late round picks. So it's somebody like a Carter Warren's going to have to develop into a quality backup for this team. So, if your backups aren't really going to be that good, you better your starters better be healthy. And AVT, of course, he enters this season as kind of a question mark because of his injury history, but all signs indicate that AVT ready for week 1, according to Robert Saleh. And the other update he gave is a guy the Jets just brought in, Mike Williams, who, of course, coming off a torn ACL. And what's interesting is I've heard Williams referred to as like this major injury risk. And the more I look into this, the more I'm not sure I agree with it. Now, there's always a risk when you're coming off a torn ACL, but it's not like Williams has been a guy who's been consistently banged up through his career. It's not like, like someone like Tyron Smith. He's missed a lot of games through his career. Like Tyron Smith's an injury risk. It's a good look. It's a signing the Jets had to make. It's a roll of the dice for the price they got him at that it made sense for the Jets. I'm not saying that it was necessarily the wrong move, but I am saying I think any objective assessment would say Tyron Smith's an injury risk. I don't know that Mike Williams is a huge injury risk. He's a guy who ACL injuries can happen to anybody. There's no real way to predict an ACL injury is about to happen. And beyond that, he hasn't missed that many games through his career. Well, Saleh indicated that Saleh referenced Breece Hall's recovery last year from his knee injury. And if you remember, Breece Hall was a guy I was always trying to downplay expectations on how quickly Breece would be back because those knee injuries are always difficult to predict how a guy's going to recover from. But if you remember, Breece came back and he was like a great player right off the bat. His first carry went for over 20 yards. He broke an 80-yard run in his first game of the season. It was the type of thing I was expecting late in the season. I wasn't sure I was expecting it early in the season. Well, Saleh indicated that they think Mike Williams is kind of on the Breece Hall track. So if that's to be believed, and the one caveat I need to throw out is if you followed Saleh through his Jets career, his injury updates have not always been accurate. So I will throw out that caveat. But if Mike Williams is on the Breece Hall track, then that means he's probably going to be good to go week 1. Probably means you can expect it to be Mike Williams week 1, and that would be a big boost for the New York Jets offense if Mike Williams is himself in the early part of the season, because he's a perfect complement to Garrett Wilson. He's going to be an excellent number 2 receiver for the Jets if he's healthy and at full strength. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.